Imagine waking up in the 1910s. At the beginning of the decade, life still carried the shape of the Edwardian world. Streets were filled with horses, carts, bicycles, and pedestrians. Homes were heated by coal. Letters and newspapers carried the news. Class still decided how comfortable, free, and secure a person's life could be. But by the end of the decade, that world had been shaken beyond recognition. The 1910s were the decade where the old world broke, a decade of war, grief, and survival. Ordinary people lived through pressures that reached into homes, schools, factories, and streets. Life in the 1910s was not one single experience. History was no longer something happening far away. It came into people's homes. From wealthy families in London to factory workers, every life was touched by change. At the start of the 1910s, many rhythms of life still resembled the previous decade. For ordinary families, the day was built around work, local shops, and social expectations. Homes were still labor-intensive. Central heating was not normal. Washing clothes, preparing food, and managing fires took real physical effort. In wealthier homes, comfort often depended on servants. In poorer homes, space was limited, and every illness or wage loss could unsettle the household. Food was simpler and more seasonal. Shopping meant markets, grocers, butchers, street sellers, and careful household budgeting. Every rise in food prices was felt. People lived with routine, scarcity, and duty. The world was already changing, but for many people, daily life remained physically demanding and deeply local. Class shaped almost everything. It shaped the home you lived in, the food you ate, and even the clothes you wore, which immediately signaled your position in society. Respectability mattered deeply. People worried about reputation, marriage, and debt. The 1910s were made of small anxieties, the price of food, and the security of work. Work dominated life. Industrial cities were full of factories, docks, and railways. Many men worked long hours in physical jobs, where injury or illness was a constant threat. Many women worked too, in domestic service, laundries, textiles, and shops. But the war would soon make their labor more visible than ever. As men went to fight, women stepped into roles that had often been treated as male territory. They became essential to the wartime economy in factories, transport, and offices. This did not mean equality had arrived, but the idea that women were only suited to domestic life became harder to defend when entire economies depended on their work. For children, schooling was expanding, but many classrooms were formal, disciplined, and focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and obedience. Childhood was shorter than it is today. Some children continued at school, but many others helped at home, ran errands, or prepared to become wage earners early. War changed childhood. They saw recruitment posters, parades, and wounded soldiers. For many, it was personal, a father or brother gone to the front. Technology was changing life unevenly. Electricity was appearing in cities, but many ordinary households still relied on gaslight, oil lamps, and coal. Communication still moved through letters and telegrams. During the war, these carried enormous emotional weight. A letter could bring relief. A telegram could bring dread. Transport shaped the decade. Trains moved soldiers, food, and coal. The 1910s were a decade of modern power, but ordinary people still lived with delay and uncertainty. The First World War began in 1914. Men left homes, farms, and factories to join the military. Communities watched familiar faces disappear from daily life. At home, the war reshaped routines. Rationing was introduced for key foods as shortages put pressure on households. Sacrifice became a daily requirement. The cost was immense. The war brought grief into every community. It lived in the post, the newspaper, the factory, and the silence around the table. Health was fragile. Antibiotics were not yet available, and infectious diseases could devastate families. Medical care lacked the tools we take for granted today. The war accelerated surgery and nursing as doctors faced injuries on a massive scale. But as the war ended, another disaster arrived, the Spanish flu. The influenza pandemic of 1918 spread across a world already exhausted by war. For people who had just lived through years of conflict, it added another layer of fear. Even in crisis, people looked for entertainment. Music halls and early cinema offered a momentary escape and helped shape how people understood sacrifice and hope. Culture did not stop, it adapted. People still laughed, sang, and gathered, trying to feel human inside a decade that constantly asked them to endure. Worries were intense. People worried about money, food, and above all, the safety of loved ones. They worried about telegrams and whether the old world would still exist. But the decade also brought demands for change. Women's suffrage campaigns and labor movements gained force, making old certainties harder to defend. In Britain, some women gained the vote in 1918. It was not full equality, but it was a major shift. The 1910s unsettled the social and political order. Looking back, the 1910s were also a decade of ordinary mornings and family arguments. People were not living through a chapter title. They were just living through days. They did not know what the rest of the 20th century would bring: another world war, antibiotics, television, commercial aviation, computers, and the digital age. History arrived not as an idea, but as a letter, a uniform, a factory shift, a hospital bed, a queue, a silence, or an empty chair. The 1910s were not just the decade of war. They were the decade that showed how fragile the old world had been.